Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Kristen Smith, Pennsylvania editor for the Center Square. Joining me today is the Center Square's Pennsylvania reporter, Anthony Hennon. There's talk of creating an urban search and rescue team in Pittsburgh this week in the legislature. So, Anthony, tell us first, what is an urban search and rescue team and why does Pittsburgh need one?
Yeah, so there's a number of these nationally. In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania has the Pennsylvania Task Force 1, which is one of 28 federal urban search and rescue teams. These are fully federal funded. Basically, they're used for all sorts of emergencies or disasters. The argument is that, Pennsylvania is a very large state, as anyone who has driven from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh can attest. It takes a long time to move some things around in an emergency situation. As we've seen just in the past year or so, we've seen the collapse of the Fern Hollow Bridge. We've seen the train derailment in East Palestine on the Ohio-Pennsylvania border. And there's talk of making sure that Pennsylvania essentially has enough resources across the state where if something happens, if some crisis emerges, state officials and emergency officials can quickly respond to it. So we're looking at a couple bills right now, House Bill 843 and Senate Bill 792, that would establish a similar task force based in Allegheny County to respond to emergencies. There's a few complications, though. We've seen a number of state legislators support this, both in Western and in Eastern Pennsylvania. We've seen bipartisan support for this from Republicans and Democrats. When you talk to a few of the emergency officials based in Western Pennsylvania, they seem in support of it and they see a logic to it. But the director of the statewide Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency is not so gung-ho on this. Director Randy Padfield argues this is not necessarily the right approach. And so there's a bit of a tension happening here that local officials, state officials, and legislators will have to wade through.
What does PEMA think is the right approach here?
Yeah, so PEMA's main concern here is that this could result in essentially a Western versus Eastern divide, rather than taking a more of a statewide look at things, essentially investing all the resources around Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, rather than trying to put, say, some more resources in the south central portion of the state or the northern portion of the state, which still would be hours away from some of this equipment resources. But there's also a concern about general readiness or wasted resources. So Padfield essentially argued, while I think it makes a perfect addition to the capabilities in the West, it also potentially detracts from the capabilities across the rest of the state for residents. I need to advocate for consistency across the state, readiness and preparedness across the state. And the concern that I would have is that this becomes an East and West issue, and then we never get around to addressing what's best throughout the rest of the state. So essentially, there's some concern about most of these resources going toward two parts of the state rather than more evenly distributed. Also, because the Philadelphia Task Force is federally funded, this could require more state resources going to build the second task force and then taking away from a more regional approach where, throughout when you're looking at these teams, there's a number of other teams. There's essentially three different tiers, or actually, I believe 5 different tiers of capability as to who has the resources to respond to different situations. In Pennsylvania, the biggest threat that we're talking about here is generally flooding. When these federally created task force came about, this was post 9/11. There was concern about terroristic threats and things of this nature. But generally, when you're looking at how these task forces are used, it's about flooding, natural disasters. So there's a concern of putting too much resources and building these teams out when it might be best we already have the capability here, and reinvesting these resources in an organized tiered response system, as Padfield phrased it, could be more appropriate. There's also concerns of repeating similar mistakes as Maryland did. Maryland created a second task force that later was dissolved because there wasn't a significant need. And basically all of that funding, all that equipment got redistributed throughout the state. So, there's some pros and some cons here. When we're looking at how these funds could be spent, it may make more sense to kind of spread them around the state. But, Pittsburgh lawmakers are also arguing that, we already have a disparity here with everything being focused on Philadelphia, and so Pittsburgh could be a good first step. But we'll see what happens here. This is sort of a slightly surprising disagreement here, where generally it's not as divided, but it's something to consider.
Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. For Anthony Hennon, this is Kristen Smith. Please subscribe, and thanks for listening.